Every single week, someone leaves a comment on this channel that says some version of the same thing. The fundamentals are perfect. The news keeps getting better. So why is the price still going nowhere? And I'm going to tell you something today that most channels won't say out loud, because they're too busy telling you what you want to hear instead of what you need to understand. The regulators just built the runway. The CFTC, the SEC, the White House, they all went on camera in the last 48 hours and described in precise technical detail the architecture of a new financial system. A system where XRP isn't a speculation, it's infrastructure, and the price barely moved. That's not a contradiction. That is the signal. And if you're watching this, you're about to understand exactly why. Welcome back. This channel exists for one reason: to cut through the noise, apply the data, and tell you what's actually happening beneath the surface of the market. No hype, no hopium, just the structure. Let's get into it. Let me start with the hard truth that most people watching this market have completely backwards. When the price doesn't react to good news, the crowd says the news doesn't matter. They say the market is broken. They give up. But here is what institutional analysts understand that retail almost never does. Price does not lead infrastructure. Infrastructure leads price. And the gap between when the rails get laid and when the train actually runs, that is the accumulation window. That is where you are right now. The CFTC acting chairman just went on camera and described point by point what Project Crypto looks like. This isn't a press release. This isn't a rumor. This is a regulator standing at the podium describing a taxonomy between securities and digital commodities, and telling financial institutions that the rules they've been waiting for are coming within weeks, not years. He specifically named perpetual futures markets. He said these markets have existed since the early days of crypto, but they've been pushed offshore, to Asia, to the Bahamas, to Europe, because the prior administration made the United States hostile territory for compliant firms. And he said, on the record, that the CFTC intends to bring those markets back onshore within the next month. Think about what that actually means. There are trillions of dollars in derivative exposure that currently lives offshore, outside U.S. jurisdiction, outside U.S. investor protections, outside U.S. regulatory oversight. The CFTC just said, "We are building the legal container to bring that home." And then the SEC commissioner went further. He talked about settlement, about the fact that in the 1980s, a securities transaction took T+5, 5 full business days to clear and settle. And he described, in front of a live audience at the Milken Institute Future of Finance Summit, the vision of T+0, immediate on-chain delivery versus payment. No intermediaries sitting in the middle collecting fees and holding your assets in limbo for days. And then, and this is the moment I want you to rewind and watch again if you missed it, he said Ripple is working with BNY Mellon on tokenized bank deposits. Not a startup, not a proof of concept. BNY Mellon, one of the oldest custodial banks on the planet, working directly with Ripple to test on-chain settlement infrastructure. That's not noise. That's the foundation being poured. Now let's do the math that the retail crowd ignores, because this is where it stops being a story and starts being a structural inevitability. The global foreign exchange market processes approximately 7.5 trillion every single day. Not annually, daily. Every 24 hours, 7.5 trillion moves across borders through a patchwork of correspondent banks, nostro-vostro accounts, and intermediary institutions that each take their slice and slow the process down. Right now, somewhere between $27 trillion in capital is locked inside nostro and vostro accounts around the world. Money that exists purely to pre-fund transactions that haven't happened yet. It's sitting there, not earning a return, not being deployed, just waiting to make sure the plumbing doesn't fail. That is the inefficiency XRP was engineered to eliminate. Now here's the math. XRP has a fixed total supply of 100 billion tokens. Circulating supply sits around 55 to 57 billion. Exchange reserves have been declining for months. The liquid supply is shrinking, not growing. If you want to move $7.5 trillion in daily Forex volume through an asset with 55 billion tokens in circulation, do the math on what price is required for that to work with acceptable on-demand liquidity. We're not talking about speculation. We're talking about the mathematical requirements of the system functioning at scale. Cross-border payments represent 150 trillion annually. Derivatives markets total 1.2 quadrillion in notional exposure. The tokenization wave that BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, and Fidelity are all publicly building toward, that's a $4 trillion market in the next decade, conservatively. And this is the point I need you to really hear. This isn't a prediction, it's a requirement. If XRP captures even a fraction of the settlement layer for global financial infrastructure, the math for what price is required to make the system function without catastrophic slippage does not look like where we are today. The current price is not a verdict on XRP's value. It is a discount created by regulatory uncertainty. And that uncertainty is now officially on camera from the mouths of regulators, being removed piece by piece. When the risk premium disappears, the price gap doesn't close slowly, it closes fast. That's what the history of every major asset class tells us when regulatory ambiguity resolves. Now let's look at what the smart money is actually doing while retail is confused and frustrated. Ask yourself this: does a firm like BNY Mellon, a $2 trillion custodial institution that has survived every financial crisis since 1784, does a firm like that move without absolute legal certainty? Do they pilot tokenized bank deposits with a blockchain company on a whim? Absolutely not. They don't gamble. They position. The CFTC commissioner described something that most people glossed over in the headlines. He said the prior administration drove liquidity offshore, meaning, for years, the smart money knew this technology worked. They knew the use case was real. But they couldn't deploy capital inside the United States because the regulatory regime was hostile. So the liquidity went to Asia, to the Bahamas, to Europe. Now the regulators are explicitly inviting it back. That is not a minor update. That is a policy reversal that changes the addressable market for compliant U.S. domiciled institutions. And there is a long queue of capital waiting to enter the moment the door is formally opened. Meanwhile, Ripple has not been sitting still. Their acquisition of Hidden Road, a prime brokerage that processes over $3 trillion in annual transactions, was not a PR move. That is a firm building the pipes, quietly, methodically. While retail investors argue about short-term price action, Ripple is constructing the settlement infrastructure that institutional clients will run on. On the legislation front, the Clarity Act, which passed the House 294 to 134, including 78 Democratic votes, is closer to Senate passage than at any point in history. The White House crypto advisor, Miles Jennings, is personally in those negotiations. The sole sticking point is not whether digital assets get clarity. It's a narrow disagreement about stablecoin yield between Coinbase and the banking sector. And here's what the Republican chairman of the House Financial Services Committee just said publicly. If the compromise fails, Congress moves forward with the original House bill anyway. The train is leaving the station. The question is just which version of the ticket gets stamped. This isn't retail FOMO. This is calculated, sovereign-level positioning by custodians and market makers who have been waiting for exactly this moment. So what are the specific triggers you need to watch? Let me give you the actual timeline, not the vague hopium version. Within the next 30 days, the CFTC has publicly committed to announcing regulations for perpetual futures on U.S. soil. When that announcement lands, the institutional arbitrage window between offshore and onshore derivative markets begins to close. U.S. compliant capital that has been sitting in offshore venues starts looking for onshore homes. Within the next 60 to 90 days, On-chain market guidance is coming from the CFTC on what types of digital wallets, DeFi protocols, and blockchain front-ends actually fall within their regulatory scope. This is the DeFi clarity moment. When this drops, the on-chain financial ecosystem in the United States gets its operating license. In the Senate, the stablecoin bill is, by the White House's own admission, very close. The negotiating framework already exists. The parties are not far apart. When that deal closes, and the White House is actively brokering it, it triggers the domino that passes the broader Digital Asset Clarity Act. When the Clarity Act passes, the risk premium across the entire digital asset class reprices in real time. That is not a gradual drift. That is a gap-up event. The institutions that have been waiting for legal certainty don't ease in over months. They execute previously staged orders. The wait-and-see capital becomes all-in capital. The fuse is already lit. The timeline is measured in weeks and months, not years. Here is the uncomfortable reality about where we are in this cycle. Exchange reserves for XRP have been in a sustained decline. Tokens are moving off exchanges and into custody solutions that are not coming back to market to take a 20% profit. When a sovereign wealth fund, a pension manager, or a prime brokerage custodies a digital asset, they are not trading it. They are holding it for the structural purpose it serves. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity. And most retail investors will not recognize that transition until it's already happened. The prior administration spent 4 years creating regulatory conditions that forced legitimate institutional capital offshore, suppressed price discovery, and gave the patient accumulator every opportunity to build a position at artificially discounted prices. That suppression window is closing. The CFTC commissioner said it on camera. The SEC commissioner said it on camera. The White House said it on camera. Once the Clarity Act passes, the risk premium that has been artificially holding this asset class down evaporates. The price doesn't walk up. It adjusts to reflect the new risk environment. And at that point, the retail investor who is waiting for confirmation is not buying XRP at today's price. They're buying it from the institutions who accumulated it during the uncertainty. The institutions have spent years trying to shake you out so they can take your position. I know it is hard to watch the market right now. I know it is genuinely painful to see regulatory news that would have pumped any asset class in any other era land with barely a reaction. I understand the frustration. It is real and it is valid. But let me ask you the brutal question. What are you actually looking at? Because if you're looking at the price, you're looking at the noise. If you're looking at the structure, the regulatory architecture being built, the institutional partnerships being announced, the legislative timeline being laid out in public by sitting regulators, then you are watching something that has never existed before in the history of this asset class. The CFTC is building an on-chain regulatory framework. The SEC is approving tokenized money market funds and describing T+0 settlement on camera. The White House has a crypto advisor in active negotiations over legislation that defines how the entire industry operates. BNY Mellon is piloting tokenized bank deposits with Ripple. This is not a pump-and-dump cycle. This is the construction of permanent financial infrastructure. And construction looks boring from the outside. It looks like noise. It looks like nothing is happening until the building opens. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment reality catches up. The question is not whether the structure gets built. It's already being built. The question is who is still holding when that structure goes live. Here's where I leave you today. The regulators just described, in public, the blueprint for on-chain global finance. They named T+0 settlement, perpetual futures, DeFi frameworks, and tokenized assets. They named Ripple and BNY Mellon in the same sentence. They said the rules are coming in weeks, not years. The market shrugged, and that shrug is the last gift this window will give. Price is a distraction. The structure is the reality, and the structure has never been more clear. If you are one of the informed, if you are someone who watches the architecture, and not just the ticker, then you already know what this moment is. Comment runway below if you made it to the end and you see what's being built, because I want to know who in this audience is actually paying attention. Stay rational, stay patient, stay positioned. The math doesn't lie, and the runway is almost complete.